the way that we were thinking before the large language models like ChatGPT, we're still thinking in terms of databases. And that is quite unsuitable actually for biology, because a lot of times individual relationships or associations are not true in all contexts. So it's actually quite a layered, this gene might be activated in this tissue, but not in this tissue. So you actually always need a context to your relationship. And that is quite hard to do in a relational database. Often people try to use very complex models to actually understand biology. And that is not always the right thing, right? We don't really use GPT to understand the English language. But because biology is so complex, there's always a hope that the model somehow encodes something about the biology that we didn't know before. Now you have these large language models that can encode quite complex relationships and different ways of context that is just embedded in the bigger model. I don't subscribe to this idea of we don't need human scientists, AI can completely take care of it. But I think it has the potential to just speed up research by quite a bit, especially in life science. What we're going to find is a lagging behind of data generation technologies. That's going to be the limiting factor now.
Hi guys, welcome to another episode of the GCS Leaders Series Podcast. We've got Aylin Cakiroglu today. She is an expert in AI and biotech, and it's a really interesting conversation where, as with quite a few of our recent episodes, we really talk about what AI is bringing and what it can't bring at this moment to the world of technology, to the world of business, and to the world of commerce, with a focus within science and drug development. We definitely can see the benefits that this technology can bring. So, without further ado, here's Aylin. Aylin, hi, how are you?
Hi, I'm not too bad, enjoying the sun after a long time of rain.
That's right, yes, it's been horrendous weather. And
every day, rain so far.
Every day. So yeah, hopefully we can get beyond that. I mean, I think when we release this, I hope it'll be in March. So the weather will be picking up somewhat, but yeah, so no, let's hope so. Anyway, it's great to have you on the podcast, Aylin.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, I mean, we've been very much kind of focused around AI over the past kind of 2-3 years, which isn't a really surprise. It's a technology podcast, and we're really keen to kind of get you on board, because I think the area that you specialize in, which is kind of, pharma, biotech, and how AI integrates with that, is something that I'm very interested in. I know you are very interested in, because it's your specialized subject, but also I know that our listeners are, because AI basically touches all industries. But I think the good that it can do within this industry is something that's maybe overlooked sometimes. People talk about the negative sides of AI, but don't maybe think about the positive sides of AI so much as in this situation. So before we kind of go into it, could you just give us a bit of a flavor of your background, who you've advised with, who you work with, and why you're seen as a specialist in this area?
My scientific background is in maths. Done a degree back home in Germany in maths, and then did a PhD in maths. And was lucky enough that someone in computational biology, PI, back then at the London Research Institute, funded by CA UK, now the Francis Crick, took me up. Nick Lascombe was the first mathematician ever reaching out to him, and he was intrigued. So we said, we give it a go. Let's see how you can get to in 2 years. And, it was just an incredible, very, very steep learning curve, but I just found it so amazing that I could use my skills, not, in insurance or banking, which all my friends were doing, but actually to find out what's happening in our bodies, and trying to understand what's going on and how we can, figure out, disease processes and biological underpinnings of that. So ever since, I've been just, really fascinated by that. So I did quite a long postdoc at the Crick, and then went into industry. So I'm one of the, if you're academic, you always look at it as the evil as this going into industry. But actually, I found it just brought me one step closer to making an actual impact. It might be, 15 years into any patients will really, benefit of what I'm doing today. But it's just such an profound impact you can have with your skills. So again, I thought, for me, that was just such an incredible place to be afterwards. So I met people from Benevolent AI, which was back then at, its height. So the core premise of Benevolent was, if you mined all scientific literature or public data sets and you find relationships between things of interest like genes and diseases and processes, and you mine all of that, get all of the relationships out, you put it all into a knowledge graph, you will find undiscovered biology that just nobody has seen, but the connections are there to infer it. It was a really exciting time to be there. We had just gotten like a really big investment round. We had started a collaboration with AstraZeneca. So for me to join there and, really working on disease programs that might lead into something that might be on the market at some point was just so exciting. So I was there as a AI scientist and I spent there, 3.5 years really developing from, coding every day and becoming, technical lead and kind of seeing the whole process from, using biological data to texture data.
And that's really to revolutionize, the world of pharmaceutical and drug discovery. I guess for people that kind of coming from outside this world, maybe it's interesting for them to understand how that revolution actually happens, to kind of go from, most people wouldn't even understand the basics of it. I don't. So how is it revolutionizing it? How is AI and the use of data in research actually changing what actually happens? If you could maybe give us a kind of a simple kind of layperson's example, that would be great.
Let's say maybe with the Benevolent kind of setup, it was always around augmenting how a human scientist would do their research and making their life easier and their journey to discovery faster. So you can imagine if you're a scientist and you want to get into a new topic or you want to understand a new disease, there's a huge amount of literature you would have to sort through. Some might be relevant, some might be not, some might be repeating. Sometimes you see something mentioned only once. Can you really believe that? So what we were doing at Benevolent at scale was just mining that information and presenting it to someone in a very easy, digestible way. So you would see the connections, you would see where things were being cited, you could click on the papers. So it would just create a really easy way to jump into a new topic or a new understanding of a disease area for someone. So that's like one way. It's always around, I guess, summarizing really complicated and complex data that we capture around biology that, also evolves over the time where, knowledge evolves, but also the way we can measure things in this area evolves. And how do you all, present it and all put it together around this one disease or biological mechanism? That's kind of where AI comes in.
And with the changes in AI, because obviously you started there, and I think kind of when you left your postdoc in 2019, and obviously it's in around 22, 23 that maybe the public available GPT systems coming out. Has that revolution now sped up even more as the more powerful tools are there to help you?
Yeah, 100%. So I think, the way that we were thinking before the large language models like ChatGPT or GPT, that's at the core of it, we were still thinking, the way I described it, and it's a graph and it's a relational database. We were still thinking in terms of databases. And that is quite unsuitable actually for biology, because a lot of times individual relationships or associations are not true in all contexts. So it's actually quite a layered, this gene might be activated in this tissue, but not in this tissue. So you actually always need a context to your relationship. And that is quite hard to do in a relational database. Now you have these large language models that can encode quite complex relationships and different ways of context that is just embedded in the bigger model.
So the coming of the new GPT technologies, because obviously you worked for Benevolent for 2019, I think then you went to Cosign. Did that revolutionize the revolution, if you know what I mean? That really kind of supercharged it?
100%. At Benevolent, the way I was describing, we were still thinking about relational databases. We were like extracting relationships and representing them in databases, and then somehow serving that to the user. Now we have language models, right? You actually don't necessarily need the knowledge graph anymore. You can you yourself can go to ChatGPT and just ask it about a biological topic that you want, and you will get quite a lot of information back and quite a lot of relevant information. And that is then something that we actually started exploiting at Cosign, looking at, now there's a big talk about agentic systems and how can you exploit, which just means you have a series of these language models that are hooked up to tools. So maybe one can search the internet, one can search a database, one can take all of that information in and write a report about it. So all of a sudden, actually, you don't need to think so much more about, representing the data in a database and relationships and how do you do all of that. You just have databases of your data, and you have these models interrogating those databases and just returning a quite nuanced report to you about topics that are really left field and quite, rare diseases nobody has heard about. So it has, I think, changed the field quite a bit, and we are only at the beginning of that. I think agents have been around for a year, so we don't really, we haven't even scratched the surface in terms of what you can do with it. The things we are doing right now, they're quite stupid and silly. It's kind of like little if then statements and search this database, but there are papers now coming out using reinforcement learning on those systems. So I think it's going to be quite exciting to see where things will be going in the next few years.
So, and I think this is an important question. You are someone who I assume is very positive about what AI can do for healthcare. That it's going to have this revolution is going to be positive and help human health. Would you kind of put your flag in the sand and say, yes, I agree? I know there'll be caveats and obviously challenges, and we'll talk about that. But overall, do you see this as a beneficial move forward?
Yes. Overall, I think it has also been overhyped.
Okay.
Right? So I don't subscribe to this idea of, we don't need human scientists. AI can completely take care of it. But I think it has the potential to just speed up research by quite a bit. And actually especially in life science, what we're going to find is a lagging behind of data generation technologies. That's going to be the limiting factor now.
And is that one of the most significant challenges, in kind of balancing out the kind of the possibility versus the reality of what it can actually do for you?
Yeah, I think that's probably one of my favorite pet peeves is, I think with the excitement of GPT and all this and the scale, I think we quickly, or as a field, we quickly jumped in and said, oh my God, we're going to train all these foundation models and on, million of data points. But actually we haven't really stopped and asked, are we actually set up in terms of data foundations to do this at scale? And, there's this like fallacy of, just more data will solve it. But if you just add really noisy data to even more noisy data, it just doesn't really solve the problem. And, the thought of, maybe if I have a much more complex model, maybe it can take care of the noise and the technical, biases in the data. But that is also not true, right? Like the more complex your model you use, the more complex noise it trains to. And biological data is just fundamentally different to text and to images. We don't measure everything that's relevant. We don't sometimes know what's relevant. Most of the times, we measure a proxy of what we're actually interested in. If something isn't there in the data, we don't know whether it's truly absent or whether our technology just couldn't pick it up. And clinical data is even worse. I worked on a project as a postdoc on using kind of GP records with patients with cardiovascular disease. And I could show that whether or not they had a test result 6 months before their heart attack, that was predictive, not the values. Nothing of the actual test was relevant. It was just whether or not they had the test, which is, I mean, if you think about it, it makes sense, right? Like a doctor won't prescribe a test unless, the patient's not feeling well, which means, they're more likely to have a heart attack. But, a model might just happily learn that, the pattern of missingness, and it doesn't really tell you much about the biology of the disease.
So as the technology progresses, how do you address those kind of problems of expectation versus reality? What do you have to do as a leader? How do you kind of control your investors and your backers and your teams to get something that is useful?
So I think there's like two things. I think on one hand, when you talk to investors or leadership, I think you have to be very clear about limitations and really be transparent about, this is what we can do with the data, this is what we can't do, these are the limitations of the models, and this is how far you can really trust those predictions. The other side of the coin is thinking about how do you evaluate these models, and especially when it's around drug discovery, where it takes 15 years until you have a drug on the market, that can't be your main metric, right? You need some intermediate metrics. And they might not be very easy to find if you don't have a ground truth or your ground truth is ambiguous. So if I try to do some unsupervised clustering for some patients, do my clusters, are these subtypes, are these biologically relevant subtypes? How do you evaluate that? And you wanna have like multiple layers of evidence. You look at, can you associate some biological relevance with your clusters? How does it hold up across different data sets, across different model runs? And you do that if you do that in an interdisciplinary way, where you bring in people who really understand the biology and the disease profiles really well, and you start from the beginning. At day one in a collaboration, determining, okay, we want to do this thing, we want to predict this thing. What is a good benchmark? Are we overlooking edge cases that are actually more interesting and more important to get right than maybe the average? And you start defining these frameworks together from day one. It will give you an indication, can I evaluate my model before you spend time and effort on developing it? Or is there will just never be a really good evaluation for it, and we will never really know whether it's doing what we think it will be doing, which will give you, you might still go for it, but it gives you an indication of maybe how deep you want to go with it and how far you want to push it.
I guess that links in some ways to how all industries are dealing with AI, in that, whether you're in the recruitment industry or in the finance industry, you're hopeful that this can be a game changer. But then when you look under the bonnet, sometimes, and I've seen this in my own business, it's not quite as good as you'd hoped it would be. So the next question I've got is, as a leader, and let's say you're the head of AI or the AI director for one of these businesses, and it's an AI focused business within that industry, and you can get AI disruptive businesses within all industries. Would you say, and this is more of a political thing, would the people that deal with the data become more important and than the people that kind of know the science? And I know you know both sides, right? So you kind of understand where it's coming from. And is there always a bit of a kind of a battle between the two, like, the kind of head to head, or have you worked out ways to make that relationship more fluid and profitable?
I think the best collaborations or the best work I've seen was when both sides were genuinely interested in the other side. So you get, biologists who are genuinely interested in how the modeling works and what the limitations are. And on the other side, you have machine learning experts who want to understand the biology and the data and are really curious about it and are gonna, if they see something weird happening with their model, they're gonna go and investigate and ask people, why am I seeing this? And I think if you get that kind of symbiosis going, I think you can learn so much from each other. But you genuinely make a difference there, rather than working almost like a client relationship where I go away and I train a model and I come back to you and show it to you. So I think that's the best way of setting it up. So I'm really keen on building these teams where you can really work together across disciplines. It's not easy. I think there's a lot of language and culture that comes from different domains you need to bridge. But when you manage to do it, and I've worked in teams like that, it's just it's really fascinating what can come out.
And from your experiences, what's the best way to build that symbiosis, like you say, to get two sides? Is it down to the hiring that you do? Is it how you set the project up? How do you create the atmosphere where both sides are helping each other?
I mean, it does come down to hiring a little bit. So I always like to go, when I hire machine learning talent, I feel like machine learning expertise you can teach, but genuine curiosity, that's like innate, like either somebody is really interested in it or not. So I do look for that. In terms of team, like there's still something you need to do around the culture, because just because someone is curious, that doesn't mean that the magic will happen. You do need to create an environment where it's safe to say I don't know this. It's safe to ask quite stupid questions, because if you're not an expert in something, you will ask sometimes stupid questions, and you need to have a team that will react to that in a respectful way and explain quite basic concept or basic for them. Also, I think create an environment where people are comfortable, sharing failures. I think, most in research doesn't work. So having people working together and me modeling the same behavior as well, and saying, I tried this and it just didn't work. And really figuring out what have we learned from this. And failure in this like research endeavor doesn't mean failure in your job, and kind of like trying to disentangle these two things. So it's a lot around team culture and ways of working, as well as hiring, I would say.
And I guess another key kind of element within the pharmaceutical or biotech industry is obviously the need for compliance, the need for safety. How do you balance that between like the pressures, even probably greater now that we've invested all this money in the science, but also in the technology now. So how do you do that? Because obviously those are the kind of the long-term goal is to release drugs, is to discover drugs. But even with AI, it's still very difficult. So how do you balance those two out?
Yeah, I mean, that's like quite a big tension, isn't it? And like I think in the companies that I worked in, scale-ups and startups, they are there to disrupt, but you're trying to disrupt in a highly regulated industry. And I think you need to figure out where do you need to comply to this like highly regulated framework, and at what point can you be freer? So anything that you base a decision on, like clinical decision, whether that is like patient population for clinical trials or target selection, which compound to take forward, these things you need to be versioned. You need to have your environment set that needs to be rigorous, needs to be validated. Everything is kind of like automated in a way. Things get tested, it doesn't break. That is not really conducive to moving fast, breaking things, trying things out in exploration. So you need a different framework for that part, and like a clear cut between the two. So ideally you have two different computational platforms. Like one is for production, once I push to that, this is like done. I know which steps I need to do to firm up what, my new capability that I'm adding. And this is now in production, and we know it's very documented and versioned. But then, I have the quick and dirty framework where I can just, I can just let loose, and I won't break anything that's in production. But I can work really fast and figure things out. And this might even include things that you do for internal tooling, right? Like, as long as it's not, you don't base decision on it, but maybe it's something where you work with your translational scientist colleague, and you were like, oh, I think I can, find this information really quickly for you. And they're just going to use it on the side to enhance some of their understanding. That maybe doesn't have to be, so rigorously validated. So I think having these like frameworks, parallel tracks where you have a clear cut from one, when you go from one to the other, just kind of on the organizational point of view.
So again, going back to the premise of this is that it will have a really good effect. I guess, again, most people think that it will be able to move science forward quicker, and that more drugs will be discovered. Are you starting to see that? Because obviously the pipeline of building drugs is quite slow, right? If let's say GPT was invented in 22, 23, or available to the public, agents have been going for the last 2 years. So would you say that we would see the outcomes of this towards the end of the decade, or would that happen? Is it going to be a slow turnaround? Because from what you're saying, it sounds like there's quite a lot of tensions. There's quite a lot of things to work out before we really do get to that utopia where it's all working very well.
I mean, there's certain things that's still gonna take a long time. So I think the individual business can speed up, but ultimately you have to run your clinical trials and have to have them successful. And depending on your disease, these might take, if you look at Alzheimer's, this is not a quick trial to run. So there's still things in there that are just not, it's going to be very difficult to speed up. I think there's still a huge amount of things we're leaving on the table. So for one, if you look at the number of drug targets, so we have about 20,000 proteins in our bodies, but we only target 600.
So with this long run up in terms of the drugs and the ways it's changing, how do you best run your teams? Now you're working as a consultant and working with Francis Crick and also an independent consultant. When you're looking at new projects, what's the best piece of advice that you can give to people in terms of making sure that companies get the best outcome from their usually quite large investments?
I guess so. One thing when I look at that is looking at is there enough data? Is the data there, and is there enough signal in the data to warrant any whatever they want to do? Can you actually see enough signal in there? That's number one. I think number two is what's the ultimate goal here? Because I think often people try to use very complex models to actually understand biology. And that is not always the right thing, right? We don't really use GPT to understand the English language. It's going to be quite hard. But because biology is so complex, I think there is there's always a hope that the model somehow encodes something about the biology that we didn't know before. And in my experience, that's just really hard to know, hard to evaluate. So, do you want a really good binary answer of a model that can tell you this is a normal sample and this is not a normal sample, and that's that's the only thing you care about? I think perfect, right? And you have the amount of data. Is it kind of like we want to see what happens and understand the biology from, and maybe the model encodes something? I would probably advise not to go down that route, because that's a world of pain that awaits you, in my experience.
So when you're talking to people, I guess part of the part of your job, therefore, is to kind of, make expectations more realistic. When you're starting to talk to people, it's like, what can we actually do? What is possible to do, as opposed to people just feel, yeah, we can do everything. Is that must be quite tricky to do, because you're basically lowering people's expectations.
It's about being realistic, and I think that's how you build trust, right? Like any being honest and realistic about what the limitations are and what you can actually do. In my experience, just these people come back with, okay, now we have something else, or maybe we can do something in terms of the data acquisition, to help us. And I think any type of overselling, it's just gonna destroy those the trust you need for those kind of conversations. So it's a necessary thing to bring the realism. But I also think, there is that about it, but I also think there's a genuine excitement about what these new technologies can bring. And I think we haven't quite seen yet what, GPT and, Claude, and like what they can really make an impact. We had, I think I saw on Twitter or X that they hooked up ChatGPT to an automatic lab. We haven't actually done these things, right? So I think these things it's going to be really exciting over the next few years to understand, can you do it? How does it work? Is it doing anything useful? And then figuring out how do we get it to make something useful. But I've seen, like, even at Cosign at that time, like really exciting ways of exploiting it to just shorten, work that took, someone weeks to do into hours. So and that was us with a really, really small team. So I think that's something quite exciting coming. So I think we're quite, on one hand, there's realism. But on the other hand, I'm also like really excited because I think there's going to be quite an exponential curve coming.
So you're between two camps as well, the academic side and the business side, and you've kind of worked and consulted within both. Again, what's your opinion of who can best use the kind of the moves of AI? Because maybe in academia there's less immediate need to kind of get profit to turn this, so you could potentially see more benefits from how AI could help.
It's true that we, in industry, you wanna always look at, what's the actual impact. But I think there's a lot of commonalities, especially when I'm talking about speeding up someone's process about research, right? I think that's just widely applicable. I think it frustrates me a little bit how siloed things can be. So once you're in a startup, IP becomes everything, and you're not allowed to talk about what you're really doing and share it with, maybe people outside. So it's a little bit frustrating, but at some point these things will spill out into the wider public, and academics are able to use it. And I think there are quite exciting things that are happening and coming out of startups, right? There's like all these, your agent bioinformatician that you just upload your data and it analyzes it for you, like people who are, just spend their day in the lab. For people like that, it's gonna be a game changer, being able to just even look at their data without having to ask for help. So I think you're right. There is a huge amount that can be done in academia, and it's like a little bit. I think in particular with AI, it's a little bit sad because of the compute cost that academia usually can't afford. The really exciting stuff and the new stuff are happening. Even in the small startups like Cosign, we still had a bigger compute budget than I would have had in my academic lab. So it is a bit sad, but equally, you also have to see there's also big questions about, how do you, if something works in a paper, and as in my career, I've always relied on academic research and looked at papers and read papers and figured out, can I use this, for our applications? And the big question is always, if something works in a paper, does it actually work in practice does it work in a setting where you really need to rely on those predictions? And the answer is not always, right?
And it sounds like you really need to have a joined up, process between all of these different settings. So for someone kind of moving into a kind of a leadership role within this industry, and taking something on, what's the best advice that you can give in terms of, successfully running these projects and hopefully delivering, fantastic drug discovery?
I mean, on one hand, I think the one thing is I think is any technical person going into leadership position will miss the very hands-on technical work and struggle with, going from an individual contributor where you're the technical expert in the room, you have all the answers, to the person who is enabling others and is leading through asking questions and controlling your urge to provide the solution when it's about, building the team's capability and figuring, some of this stuff out themselves. So I think that's kind of the crux that I'm still struggling a little bit with that. I still feel like I want to code something and make a POC. And I think the way that things are going, it's so fast. If you don't, it's just so easy to lose touch and understanding of what's actually happening in AI at the moment. So I think that's kind of probably a quite necessary but difficult step for everyone, I think. I think what's special in the drug discovery or life sciences is the fact that no single person can make a decision because they don't hold all of the information or the different views necessary to make a decision. So the way you make decisions, enable teams to make decisions becomes quite important because all the experts in the room need to be able to voice their opinion, to have a veto, to work through their issues with a decision and taking it forward if it's an important and irreversible risk decision, right? So that is, I think, quite specific for this kind of type of work. I think another one is maybe also specific to drug discovery, especially for people that come maybe from a tech background, who are maybe more used to very quick iterations, quick feedback. This is, not it if you need to wait for 15 years to know whether truly your work has made a difference. You have some intermediate, evaluations maybe that tell you whether you're on the right track. But so you really need to have some long-term thinking and patience to going into that. But then, if it does work, it's just, the impact you might have with your career is incredible. So for me, that outweighs any shorter term quick feedback loops.
I think it's really important to know, you're kind of changing humanity, aren't you? And changing it hopefully for the better. And you mentioned one thing there where not everyone has access to all the information. Obviously, that made me think that maybe at some point the agent or the AI might have access to all the information, whether it uses it right or not, because it can keep all the information in its head, whereas we can't. Is that something that, I guess that's the crux of why people are excited, that there's this thing that can handle all the information, right? And hopefully could spew out some progress that we can't do. How far do you think we are from that? How far do you think we are from, real change, real kind of, speeding up of this process?
Like I said, I've seen it at Cosign already happening. I mean, the thing didn't make the decision. We used it as an augmentation for the scientists, speeding up their work from weeks to hours, but also, producing hypotheses in areas that were just quite obscure or very rare diseases that wasn't at their forefront of their minds. So they went like, oh, this is actually quite interesting. So I have seen it already working to the point that it can make the decision. Well, I mean, it can make a decision. That's not the problem. Is it a good decision, right? That's the real question. I wouldn't trust it right now. I don't know. I don't want to give a timeline because I think we're quite bad at judging these types of things. We're quite things. I wouldn't have guessed that agents would
Yeah,
be a thing.
you never quite know you never quite know what's coming. You never quite know what can be stepped. But I think it's still important, obviously, particularly within this sector, is that there is a lot of oversight. There's a lot of regulation, because otherwise it really would be the Wild West, as it were. We've seen what can kind of happen between these industries. So for yourself now, working as an independent consultant, what's next for you? What do you see kind of on the horizon for Aylin?
Yeah, I think it's quite an interesting inflection point, I think, that I'm seeing, like talking to different companies, seeing what people are doing. So it's an interesting time for myself in a career, but also I think in the field where there was this big hype, that is becoming clear, hasn't quite translated into reality. Some companies have suffered because of it. But then you have, the big labs or smaller AI first companies that are bringing out, foundation models in, protein structure or in chemistry that are, revolutionizing, things. But then is the question, how do they really work in practice? How do they really work in a drug discovery setting? And I think, so integrating that, but I also think the question of how do you really integrate AI capability into a working drug discovery or pharma business is unclear, because right now we have these like small companies that do AI, then they license something out or get acquired. But how do we really embed it into an organizational framework that has drugs on the market and that wants to speed up that process? I think it's not clear. I can't think of an example that has done it at scale in a really, successful way. So I find that like incredibly interesting.
Yeah.
So that's cool. Where I'm looking to see some movements and maybe be part of it.
I mean, I see it within my own industry, right? And it's mostly a lot more simplistic industry. But I see a couple of things. The first thing is, like you said, about the overhyping, in that it can't quite do. So for instance, let's say in our world, in the staffing world, what would be amazing is if the system could easily just find you the right candidates for the job. That would be perfect. So I don't even have to think about it, and it tells me the best 3 people who are all available, and it saves me a load of time. But there's so many calculations that go into that make it incredibly difficult. So that's the first thing. The technology is never quite there. Maybe it is if you invest loads of money in it. But the second thing is people feel slightly scared of it, don't they, as well? And I guess you must get that in the scientific community, kind of what does this mean for us? And you get that in the recruitment industry, and I'm sure you get that in the manufacturing industry. What does this mean for us? And I'm sure you've had those conversations, Aylin, where, what is this going to take my job? Is this going to, will you still need me? I've had these conversations with recruiters. So, for people that are, incredibly intelligent, and not saying recruiters aren't, but generally biotechnologists are known to be slightly more clever than recruiters. It's a worrying time, right? You can see the possibility, but you can also see the jeopardy, can't you?
I think, well, maybe I don't know. I don't quite subscribe to the, we will be all out of a job in like 5 years' time. I think it's just gonna make your job so much easier and so much faster, and you're gonna be so much more efficient. I already am. So I'm quite excited for that. So ChatGPT was hooked up to this like automatic lab, right? We're quite restricted with the types of experiments that you can have in an automatic lab. There's so many experiments you need. Actually, it's just so hard to do it with a robot. You actually need the person in there. And I mean, we would love to say that, biology is so repeatable, but, some experiments just work with this one person, in the hands of this one person in this one lab, and they can do it. And you take someone else and it just they can't repeat it. So I think there is a lot that comes in that somehow, maybe known or unknown, we bring that is not clear how to automate it. And I think it comes back to, do we have the data to automate it? Do I have the data on why, this person on a Sunday morning can do the experiment and it goes well and the other person doesn't? No, because if we knew what was at the heart of it, we would, try to remedy it. So I don't really see it in this particular sector to be that of an issue. I think it's rather the opposite. I think a lot of the really boring, laborious tasks that nobody wants to do, that takes hours on end, filling out spreadsheets, I think that will be automated, and you just can go back to the stuff that's actually fun.
Doing the fun bits of the job, which is exactly what I say to recruiters in my industry as well. So yeah, hopefully it's true. Let's hope so.
I mean, in your area, people still want like a human touch, right? Like I wouldn't want to be called by some AI agent. You still want like a human touch to talk through options and stuff like that. So I don't really see that part going away.
No, I totally agree. And yeah, and then maybe if the searching facilities were better, then more human beings could spend more time trying to find Aylin a really good job, because lots of the boring processes were done. So no, I totally agree with that. It's funny, I did a little example. I actually went to Berlin this weekend for a holiday, kind of a city break with my wife, and in the hotel, it was the Grand Western in Friedrichstrasse. They had a robotic Hoover, but it wasn't just a Hoover. It wasn't one of the little Roombas. It was actually like a humanoid Hoover, kind of going up and down around different kind of carpets. And I was like, wow, this is, I'm sure nobody likes the job of hoovering. So this is a good thing. It's helping us. And I think that's the way we've got to look at it. We need these robot Hoovers to help us out, so that the hotel can focus on giving the best possible, experience. And it was a great hotel, so maybe it's helping. So yeah. A big shout out to the Grand Western in Berlin. You been to Berlin much, Aylin, in your time?
Yeah, I grew up in Braunschweig, which is not too far from Berlin. So that was like it's like 1.5 hours on the fast train. So yeah. It's not the best time to go to Berlin. Yeah. I have to say, it's a little bit.
It was cold and snowy, and it was very, very cold and very snowy. That's for sure. But we spent a lot of time enjoying ourselves in beer houses and that sort of thing. So that was good. But yeah, I just I saw a few automated robots on my way. So I thought that were kind of was interested to see how the whole of industry is changing. Biotech is such a dynamic, progressive industry, because it's really at the forefront of technological advancement, but it's happening everywhere. And some of the questions I think you're dealing with and that you're answering today are questions that you'll have in the hotel industry and in the recruitment industry and the staffing industry. They're all the same, similar sort of questions: is what does this really mean, and what can this really mean for us in terms of progress? So yeah, it's been great to speak to you today, Aylin. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I know that you're one of these people that are going to hopefully help humanity over the next 10 to 20 years. So that's great to hear. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, David. Thanks for having me. It was really fun. A really fun conversation to have.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Thanks very much, Aylin. Have a great day.
Thank you.